And I think that we live in a world where we're entering a period of increased challenges and an increased need for us as humans to collaborate, get along and be productive together. And we're perhaps at the same time entering the highest degree of divisiveness and social conflict that we've had in my lifetime and potentially since the Second World War. And so you see these two things together, right? And I think it's really important that if we're able to, we work on things that will improve this situation, because we sure have a lot of problems that we're going to need to really be able to work well together on as a species.
That is Rob Morris, and this is episode 44 of the Blockchain Pro podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 44 of the Blockchain Pro podcast. I'm Adriana and today's guest is Rob Morris. Rob and I work together. We've known each other for about 4 years and have had many conversations about crypto and all things decentralized. And I'm super excited to bring this episode for you so you can get to know Rob. Let's go. Hi, Rob.
Hey, Adriana. Lovely to be here with you today.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited about this episode. I'm generally excited about everyone I speak to, but you know, you and I speak on a daily pretty much, so I'm most excited about it.
Yeah, I was really, podcast number 42 came around and I was like, dang it, I really wish I could have done 42. 43 is perfect though.
Actually, you'll be 44. Because
44.
I'm releasing 43 this week, and then you'll be 44.
44 is perfect.
I think so too. It's a beautiful number. All right, so let's go back in time. Tell us, how did you start your professional life?
Do you want the long story or the short story?
I want the long story because I like your story. I think it's inspirational in a lot of ways.
Thank you. So I was born in the 70s, in 1979. And so I was really, my parents bought me a Commodore 64 when I was just 3 years old. They had a notion that computers might be important in the future, quite correctly. But back then that was sort of seen as a radical idea. And so as a result of that, I started really messing around with that thing from a very early age, in anger probably when I was about 5. And I really loved the computer, and I loved learning how to make it work. Now back then, in the 90s, when I was in primary school, it was really uncool to know how to use a computer. I got called all sorts of things for knowing about computers, like square or four eyes. I didn't have glasses, so that was a weird thing to call me. And it was really not a really popular thing, but I loved it, and nothing could pry me off that thing. I used to figure out how I could program games and all sorts of stuff. So then, that was just really, I saw it as a hobby, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I grew up, but I didn't think that, computers would become my career. And then high school was pretty frustrating for me. I just found it really boring. And I eventually got to the point where I decided that what I wanted to do was drop out of high school. And so in what became quite typical of me, I went and made a case to the principal and to my parents about why it was a waste of time for me to stay in high school, and how everyone knew that I was not going to do well in the HSC because I wasn't interested. And so I may as well go out into the real world and get a job, then come back to high school next year and see if I liked it better. And at least then there was a chance I might do well. So I went and got a job at an internet startup called X-Stream and Net Services, because pun names are in the 90s. I think we're building websites for IE2, Internet Explorer 2, and testing video games. We launched a thing called the Food and Wine Online Guide, which was the first portal in Australia. And I was calling a bunch of restaurants trying to explain to them what the web was. And they didn't know what the web was in 1996 or 95, whenever this was. And, so I just eventually say, look, your competitors are on it and it's free. And so then they'd say yes, and then we'd list them on this portal. Then I went back to high school, did really well for about a term, decided I still hated it and dropped out again, and have been working in tech ever since. I worked as a programmer. When I was a teenager, I ran a technical support team for a company. So I started as an engineer and ended up running the whole team of 30-something engineers, which is a bit weird to be a teenager and have adults reporting to me. Then I went to start a bunch of businesses and failed again and again and again. There was a business where I was putting desktop computers and fold-out tables into the back of a van and driving them to conferences so people could check their emails just before GPRS was released, and they could just do that from their phone. I tried to launch some kind of a gaming community. I was briefly involved in helping to get NetGamer off the ground on Glebe Point Road. A whole bunch of random things. Used to help people fix their computers. I have some hilarious business cards from those days, something about being proficient in DOS and that kind of stuff. And so then Q forward, I've been working as a programmer in all these different contexts and doing all of these different things in technology, small teams, large teams, failing startups left, right, and center. And we reach 2013. And I'd just come out of the back of a series of badly failed businesses. I was very broke. I owed a lot of money. I had a small family that I was providing for. And I decided that I'd still rather start a new business than go and get a job working for someone else. And so I started Prismatic. And then that was very hard, but it grew very fast. And we became a reasonably sized company of over 30 staff within a few years. And as you know, Prismatic is still around today. So I've been involved in so many different projects, not just the ones I've started, so many startups through all of that time.
You're also a bit of a legendary investor in, Sydney scene. How did you get started with that?
Yeah, I angel invest in tech startups primarily. I've invested in quite a lot of them. I just started while we were building Prismatic. Sometimes we'd be working with startups that couldn't pay us in cash. And so I'd say, it's okay if you pay us in equity. Then I discovered that it's a really bad idea to get paid for work in equity. And I decided it would be a much better idea if you just invested cash into those companies if you were going to invest into them. Either way, you're paying the money. So you may as well do it that way. And then I just started investing in companies who I wasn't providing services to. I think that there are a lot of investors who are much more technically proficient than me on the details of how you be a good investor in terms of doing an analysis of the numbers or, all that detailed work. But I just have really good instincts and a lot of experience, and I use that to figure out what I think makes sense and invest well.
Obviously, this isn't financial advice, guys, or investment advice. I guess it's good to learn from the pros, right? Where does your analysis go when looking for a new company to invest in?
I mean, building a company, it's really like the metaphor that I use is it's like trying to discover the new world. It's not like building a building. And it's the same with technology products. And so you don't know what you're going to find or where it's going to be. What you want is a really good team of navigators who are going to be able to deal with whatever gets thrown their way. But they also have to be good enough at what they do to have a reasonable idea about why they're setting out, in a ship sailing to the horizon without any idea what's out there. Might just find themselves adrift at sea without any food left. And so you are looking for people who have a good idea and who have critically thought about what they're trying to do. But for me, it's really very much, who are the people involved? How passionate are they about the thing that they're trying to do? How well have they understood what the opportunity is? Like, are they thinking clearly, basically? And then the assumption that they're going to need to pivot a bunch of times before they get to a successful company. And so just looking at, do they have the skill and the passion and the alignment to be able to do that? And, are they operating in a space where there's enough opportunity? Like, timing comes into it. I felt like the timing for a metaverse play started around last year, but I've been interested in it for 5 years. It just felt like it would be really hard to build a successful metaverse company. And it seems like a lot of other people have come to agree with me. And there's been this massive explosion of metaverse related companies over the last 12 to 18 months because the timing's great. So you're kind of looking for, I wouldn't just be looking for a metaverse startup, but also like, what's this person's unique take on it? How good a leader are they? Do I think that they're going to be successful as an entrepreneur? Are they going to be able to change course when it makes sense to? Do I have values alignment with them? Do I like them? Do I want them to succeed? All of these things.
That sounds like a very good list to start off. But I encourage everyone listening to build on that list and come up with your own criteria. That's also important.
Yeah, and I think that's important in everything that we do, but particularly in investment and building companies, is people often make the mistake of thinking that the best way for them to be successful is to copy someone else who's been successful. And I think actually the best way to be successful is to really lean into your own unique way of seeing the world, because that's what you're good at. That's what you're going to succeed at. And that's usually where the magic is, So when people do that, then they can sometimes accomplish like really wonderful things.
Indeed. I guess we got up to 2013 when you built Prismatic, but I think you were into Bitcoin right at the beginning in 2009, 8?
So it was literally the day that the Bitcoin white paper was first posted. And I have a friend who's a cypherpunk and old school hacker and, from those communities. I mean, I glossed over this part, but I used to hang out in those kind of bulletin board pre-internet communities as well. I won't explicitly say what they're all about on a public podcast. This friend was really interested in cryptography in particular for a decade and used to talk about it. And so when Bitcoin was launched, he was right across it when that white paper was posted, and he sent it to me. And so I read the paper on the day that it was released. And he was in particular really interested in it and really talking about it in a way that I didn't hear really anyone else talking about it for a long time afterwards. And so I was very lucky to have a friend like that. It still took me a while to get the memo fully, but we together started mining Bitcoin on an old CPU machine that was just lying around, and later on a GPU machine, straight away. And it's funny, right? Like, for whatever reason, my mental model of those early days was that this was a test net and that it was going to get turned off. And that never happened. It just kept going. So we just thought it was a cool technology. But the meaning of things changes over time, right? Like day one, it just seemed like, a privacy conscious, which isn't unusual in cryptography work, but a privacy conscious Japanese developer had published this really interesting technology. I didn't think of it as money, despite what the white paper said. I just thought, this is kind of cool. It seemed like an inconceivable idea that you could run a piece of software on your computer and that would be economically valuable. So for me, it just felt like, hey, let's install this server and run this and be a part of this experiment and see what happens. Right. For years after that, I really didn't take it seriously. I don't know if I remember right, but I'm sure people were trading it for a couple of cents at one point. And we, thought, why would you pay a couple of cents for one of these Bitcoins when you can literally just run a piece of software in your computer and it will spit out 50 of them or 100? I can't remember how many it was. It just seemed like a weird thing. And then the price kept going up. And then I was like, oh, maybe I should buy some of these. People seem to think they have value. And then I was like, nah, it's too late. It's cost $2 now.
Ah, that's funny. So what was some of the lessons that you learned from mining Bitcoin early on?
Yeah, like the most interesting journey I went on in the early days of Bitcoin and later other projects was going from a world where I thought academically I can understand how this worked, but I can't understand how we could live in a world where this would actually happen, to then understanding how it was inevitable that we'd live in a world where it would happen. And so in a sense, I had the fortune of spending having years to think about this thing that other people came across later. And so by the time it all started happening, I already saw it as a new version of the web. I already saw that this kind of technology would spend decades disrupting a bunch of ways that, a bunch of business models and how things would work, and started to get really passionate around some of the possible applications of it, like not just to money, but to other things like censorship resistant communities. Was fascinated with the emergence of the DAO. I'm still really interested in DAOs. I'm really interested in what's happening in NFTs, because that is, again, a shift in the way that value appreciates. And you can have these people who are creating value who are then able to participate in the value that they're creating directly rather than around the edges of it. And all of these things, whether it's community tokens, DAOs, or whether it's NFTs, or whether it's just these base layer projects, they all have that property.
So from having this broad picture of how this technology would change the web from 10 years ago to where we are now and where we're heading, what are some of the things that in like X years time we're going to be going towards mass adoption? How we are on that scale?
Yeah. So I'm blessed and cursed to doubt myself a lot. And so I have a lot of ideas. And over the years, I've slowly learned to listen to my instincts more and more and start to lean into them. And so in the first few market cycles for Bitcoin, I was still I could see where I thought it was going to go, but I had a lot of doubt about whether my theories were correct. And it didn't matter. I like the teachings of Socrates. Like, for me, it doesn't matter how many other people agree with a thing. It matters whether you can critically construct it from the ground up, and it makes sense to you if you actually try and think about it as objectively as possible. And so I never believed that all of the froth and the hype that other people were getting excited about meant that it would succeed. But I think I hit a threshold point sometime during this last bear run that we'd hit the point where it was not going to go back. I was just like looking at it unfold and projecting that out into the future. And I have useful metaphors to draw from, right? Like, I experienced the entire mass adoption phase of the web and the internet and of mobile technologies and all of these things. So I've I've seen that happen, and it follows a similar arc. It goes from knowing how to use a computer is super uncool all the way to where we are today. It goes from nobody knows what the web is to everything that's not on the web is like getting disrupted pretty much. Same happened for mobile technology. It's clearly the same kind of technology paradigm shift. And it hit an inflection point where it just was anti-fragile, and where I could have such a high degree of confidence that it was anti-fragile that I'm effectively as close as you can get to sure that it's going to continue to go in the direction I think it is now. Sorry, I know I'm giving very long answers here to simple questions.
I like long answers. Actually, I encourage them. It's all about you and your answers. All right. So you mentioned that there's a lot of things that are of interest to you in the crypto space. What are some of those? You mentioned DAOs specifically. Anything else? NFTs? What are the things that are piquing your interest right now?
I mean, I'm interested in all of it, and my interests go far beyond blockchain as well. So I'm interested in good old-fashioned decentralized and distributed computing as well, right? Good old-fashioned cryptography, businesses and startup, and all kinds of emerging tech, the metaverse. Within crypto and blockchain technologies, some of the things that I'm currently the most interested in, because I think that they're really important, are DAOs and the development of ideas around distributed and more decentralized governance mechanisms. And I'll get to why I think that's really important in a minute. Blockchains generally, the innovation around the base layers of blockchains and making them faster while preserving security, exploring the various trade-offs and the different forms that they can take so that they're useful for different things. Particularly the hybridization of crypto and blockchain technologies with non-crypto and blockchain technologies, I think is a really interesting space, and so on, right? So there's a theme for all of these things, and why I'm interested in the metaverse as well, which is I look at the world today, and I think that we live in a world where we're entering a period of increased challenges and an increased need for us as humans to collaborate, get along and be productive together. And we're perhaps at the same time entering the highest degree of divisiveness and social conflict that we've had in my lifetime, and potentially since the Second World War. And so you see these two things together, right? And I think it's really important that if we're able to, we work on things that will improve this situation, because we sure have a lot of problems that we're going to need to really be able to work well together on as a species. And I'm very, very interested in positive sum games. I'm very values driven to try and encourage positive sum games in interpersonal relationships, like reciprocal relationships. We should try to play as much of a positive sum game as possible at as much scale as possible. The problem I think that we have is that we're still learning how to do that. We've developed all of these technologies that help us to collaborate and get along effectively at scale better and better. And then they create these sort of speed wobbles and other problems, and we solve those. And so when I look at a lot of these problems, I think about them like as an environmental thing. So humans on the whole seem to be selected from an evolutionary standpoint to be tribal, right? So you get people who are exceptions to that, which is also advantageous for a species. But it would be really tough if we were all like that. Like you look at the famous chicken experiment, and if you put all of the high-performing chickens into one community, they massively underperform the community that's just got a range of different kinds of chickens, for example. And so I think that's really important, right? But it's also important to understand that, therefore, the vast majority of people are going to be quite tribal. And so if you look at that, you start to see that, therefore, the environment that they exist in is really profoundly important, because it has a huge influence on what they're going to do and how they're going to approach things. And so, for example, we know that culture flows from what people do day to day as much as it does from anywhere else. And if you acclimatize people to having to do something regularly day to day, their culture will be shaped by that. Look at all of this lockdown that we have at the moment, right? Like that will leave indelible traces and changes on our culture. So that's a little bit of preamble towards this idea that we need better ways to collaborate and at scale. Now, the problem, particularly in large groups of people, is that power tends to accumulate into sharp spikes. It's not even. And where power tends to accumulate, wherever that power is able to be sought, there are people who will be interested in that power for selfish reasons, to play a zero-sum game with it. And having gotten their grip onto that power, they'll often try and sharpen that spike and increase the unevenness of the power distribution. Now, I know I don't need to explain that to you, given the environment that you grew up in. You've seen it firsthand, and a lot more people experience it firsthand now. And so you can look at, for example, communism as not a great academic example, but at least as a good example of why it's hubristic to imagine that you can take the power from one group of people and put it into the hands of another group of people and that will solve the problems. Or in fact, the people whose job is to determine who gets the power, to imagine that they're not going to be corrupted by that. Anywhere that there is power to be pursued, people will pursue it, often for bad reasons. So the thing that we really want to be able to do is we want to make an environment and systems that are more resistant to the unproductive accumulation of power. And that's sort of like at the heart of that. Why I care about that is because I want us as a human species to all be able to work together better and have more people have more of their needs met. And I think that you must have better ability for everyone to have their needs met, find safety, and for power to be resistant to unproductive accumulation. And so I care about the inner thing around that in DAOs. And part of why that's really important and why DAOs I think are really interesting is because you're taking an element off the way that we do things and you're putting it into the hands of change-resistant algorithms that become not impossible to subvert, but much harder. And so you're slowing down actors who might want to do something and making it, let's say, harder to accumulate too much power in one place. And so DAOs are fascinating for that reason. I mean, of course, we have a lot more work to do there, and a lot of work is happening. And each of these things are a double-edged sword too. So those are some of the things that I think about.
So what can we do today to try and avoid a dystopian future as much as we can? So people that listen to this podcast, they're building stuff in the space, who are founding tech companies, working in tech companies. What can we do to ensure that the path moving forward is a good one?
Well, I think the uncomfortable truth is that the answer to that question really always comes back to us personally. The best thing that any individual can do to contribute to a better world is to own their own crap and work on that, become more wise and patient and tolerant of other people, and work through your trauma and your pathologies and all of the, improve your ability to hold perspectives. I mean, in the classical democracy sense, the idea of being able, every citizen being able to steel man and hold the perspective of other people and be able to argue that perspective. Well, if you have a whole society of those people, then everyone can engage constructively in reasoned debate and reach good outcomes. We don't live in that world, right? The vast majority of people, or at least a majority of people, they're not able to engage in constructive debate on a broad range of subjects. And so you end up needing some kind of a representation, and then power accumulates much more unevenly. So, we live in a really divisive world, and the divisiveness comes from scarcity. So each person is basically competing to get their needs met, emotional, financial, safety, all sorts of stuff, against other people. And we've been put in an environment where that environment pushes us to be adversarial. It's sort of like, you can see the universe with a few mathematical parameters, and then the rest that happens, it's all emergent, but it's based upon those. So, one of the parameters is that for humans is that negative emotions are approximately 3 times more poignant than positive emotions. And so that means that publications, for example, and social networks, for example, they're incentivized to enhance negative emotions because it's more effective at that. And so their metrics look better when they do that. And when they make design changes that stop that, their company bottom line suffers, right? And so taking a step back and recognizing that we live in a world where we're being pitted against each other, but the other person's not our enemy. They're just somebody who's in pain, who has been deceived into thinking that we're the enemy, right? Left or the right of politics, the people who are, on either side of this male versus female gender debate. We're all on the same side, right? But people have just been convinced that that other person's their enemy. And so I think that's the biggest thing that we can do individually, is to start to be able to hold the perspective of these other people, to not other group them, to not create more divisiveness. And that requires courage, because we have to make ourselves vulnerable to attack by somebody and vulnerable to pain by somebody who might use that against us in order to do that. More than that, though, what we can do is we can understand the system dynamics at play here. We should be up in arms about trying to make it so that we have better community infrastructure. We should have more small groups of people who can agree on the rules, the values, the culture of what they're doing together. And if they don't agree, they should be able to go and form their own group with people who they can agree on. where people can, I guess, like, breathe a collective sigh of relief. I can just be myself here more. I can get my emotional need for belonging and shared perspective met here. And then I can go outside of those groups to people who are less like me. And then we can have communication and conversations in a way that we're pitted against each other less. And I have less to lose because I have a place I can go where I can get my needs met, right? And so we don't get that on major social networks, and we never will, because any human group will trend towards the lowest quality people in the group and the highest safety preferences of people in the group. And what we end up with is just authoritarian censorship required for everyone to get along. And it's not the platforms that are driving that. It's the people on the platforms who will demand that because their needs aren't getting met. And so I see this as really at the heart of a lot of the problems we have today and the divisiveness and this us versus them stuff. And it wouldn't be possible if more people had processed and dealt with their own trauma, if more people were able and willing to hold the perspective of other people, and if we had better environments that would help to raise less traumatized humans, that would help for humans to have their emotional needs met better, that would incentivize positive sum behavior more effectively. And we have to connect all of that back to, well, we need to get better educated about all of the things that we do that mess up, children while they're growing up, so that they go out into the world with all this pain and lash out at other people, right? Like, we need to get better at understanding what kinds of things are public infrastructure that we should all share together. And certainly not like wait passively for a government to provide that to us, because they're incentivized not to do that either. They're part of like that. I think government's necessary and important, but it's also in recognizing that it's a really hard vehicle to make positive change in a lot of cases, right? Because it's slow by necessity, it's unwieldy, and it also suffers from the same systematic problems that we all do. So when you allow people to get together and form communities of other like-minded people, and perhaps use that to create infrastructure that they need to get their needs met. And when I say infrastructure, I'm talking like digital as well, right? Like, the power is in all of our hands to do that. That's the best thing that any of us can do, is stop passively blaming other people for our problems and own them. Stop waiting for someone else to fix our problems and own them, and come up with better things that make it easier for us to all play positive sum games together.
Be kind, learn about each other, solve your own shit.
Yeah, and remember, there's no silver bullets. So sometimes the thing that you have to do is be unkind. Like, sometimes that's it. That's actually the one thing that you need to do. And I'm somebody who would hate that. I want to avoid that at any cost. I want to be kind and compassionate to everyone, and that means that sometimes I've done the wrong thing and I've made things worse. Yeah,
I agree. Sometimes you have to be unkind, but view the world with kindness. Yeah. Like, have an open mind, right? You're not just right 100% of the time. Sometimes the other person will be right and you'll be wrong, and just, be willing to accept that.
I agree. I mean, I think it's like, I might describe it as be authentic, i.e. be emotionally honest, which is a different thing from telling the truth. You can tell the truth and deceive people, and it's just as bad as lying, right? So the point is not to tell the truth. The point is to be emotionally honest or authentic. Be humble, play positive sum games. Recognize that is the best possible thing that you can do in most situations for your own benefit and also the people around you. And it's a much more rewarding way to live life, but it's hard. And so if people develop their own ability to hold a greater perspective and their own theory of mind, and they process their own irrational reactions and the ways in which they feel unsafe, where perhaps it's not somebody else doing it to them, but a no longer useful reaction that they've developed to survive in the world. If people do that work on themselves, then they're better able to go out into the world and have their needs met, and not take away the things that other people need to have their needs met. And then we can kind of live in this world of greater scale and have more of our needs met, basically. But that's a really hard ask.
Yeah, I guess we all have a bit of work to do there. All right, final 3 questions. The quick 3. What are you currently reading? What's your favorite resource and favorite project?
Currently reading. Favorite resource, did you say?
Yes, and favorite project.
Interesting questions. I'm currently reading about 50 books which is what I tend to do. I'm reading a book called Polysecure, which I think is really interesting. It's basically about attachment theory and, let's say, non-monogamous relationship modes, basically. I would say that the resource I consider to be most valuable are small communities of like-minded people who really set your soul on fire when you talk with them and, make you excited to make positive change in the world together. I know that's technically not what you mean, but that's the kind of resource that I think is the most meaningful.
And project.
There's a project called Braid, and I joined their public working group meeting today, and there's just such a really interesting community of people. So Braid is basically a way of, it's like loosely a CRDT. They're working on a standard for the internet to allow you to effectively synchronize state between different endpoints much more effectively. The community is really, really interested in things like peer-to-peer networks and data privacy and self-sovereignty and all of the things that you can do if you don't need centralized servers managing everything. And so I think it's a fascinating and really important project. And it may well end up being infrastructure and a bunch of other projects that we consider to be important. And it's probably something that most people in crypto haven't heard of.
Oh, cool. If there's a place to find out more information about it, I will put that in the description.
Braid.org.
There you go. Thank you so much, Rob, for this awesome conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on, Adriana. It's been my pleasure. I always love an opportunity to soapbox on a few things that I care about. I hope it's interesting to some people who are listening to.
I'm sure you will be. Thank you. And that is the entrepreneurial Rob Morris. I love his story and how it demonstrates that there are many ways that one can achieve success. To get in touch with Rob, send him a message. I will add the links in the description for you. And as always, I'm here if you want to talk. Send me an email, a message. I will love to hear your feedback. Thanks so much for being on this journey with me. I will see you on the next block. Bye.